You copied an S tier build, you have most of the same gear, but when you actually play it, you barely do any damage. I've been there too, and usually the build isn't the problem. You're missing something that might not look important, but the build depends on it to actually work. The good news is you don't need to understand all of Diablo 4's damage calculation to figure out what's wrong. So today I'm going to show you what to check for when your build isn't doing the damage you expected it to and how to fix it. The first thing I look at is whether I actually have the stats for the build to function. And I'm not just talking about the same affixes listed in the guide. Some builds depend on reaching certain amounts of specific stats. Maybe your build relies heavily on critical strikes. What's your critical strike chance? Are you actually critting consistently enough for everything in the build that depends on critical strikes to work? Maybe the build depends on a skill that has a cooldown. How much cooldown reduction do you have? The build you're following might have enough cooldown reduction to keep that ability active almost permanently, while you're sitting a few percentage points below that. And sometimes a few percentage points actually matter. Attack speed, lucky hit chance, maximum resource, cooldown reduction, critical strike chance, whatever your particular build needs. Don't just ask, do I have this stat? Ask, do I have enough of this stat for this build to work the way it's supposed to? Because having the same skills and gear doesn't necessarily mean your character is functioning the same way. And this is probably one of the most overlooked parts of copying a build. Do you actually understand where its damage is coming from? It's really the easy look at a build planner, copy the skills, equip the gear, and assume you're finished. But maybe your biggest damage multiplier only works against vulnerable enemies. Are you consistently making enemies vulnerable? Maybe another multiplier requires you to have barrier. Are you actually maintaining that barrier? Maybe your main damage ability needs another skill or passive to activate first. Or maybe there's a specific rotation that allows several different bonuses to overlap at the same time. If you don't meet those conditions, the multiplier might as well not exist. This is why two characters with nearly identical gear can sometimes produce completely different damage. One character is actually activating all the things the build was designed around, the other isn't. So before you start replacing your gear, figure out what makes this build do damage. What am I supposed to activate? Am I actually activating it consistently? Now we can start looking at the actual gear, and the first thing I'd check is your aspects and uniques. Obviously make sure you actually have all the powers the build requires, but don't stop there, look at the rolls too. There's a big difference between simply having an aspect and having that aspect close to its maximum power. If an important multiplier is significantly lower than the one used in the build guide, that's damage you're missing. The same thing applies to your unique items. Sometimes a unique isn't being used just because it's a unique. The build may specifically depend on the power that item provides, and if you have a terrible roll on that power, your version of the build isn't necessarily going to perform the same way. The same idea applies to your talisman, seals, and unique charm. Look at the actual stats. Maybe the guide has a talisman giving +4 ranks to an important skill while yours doesn't. Maybe they have an additional maximum resource that their build depends on. Maybe you're using your only mythic seal because it's a mythic, but it's rolled with a stat like resistance that you don't really need because your defenses are already covered. And if the build uses a specific unique charm, make sure you have the correct one, the stats make sense for the build, and you've upgraded its power. Don't just compare the name of the item, compare what the item is actually doing for the build. Once you know you have the right gear, the next question is, have you actually finished it? This is an area where a lot of damage can be left on the table. Check your tempers. Do you have the correct ones? Did you get the greater affix version? Then look at your masterworking. If an important damage affix is being masterworked in the guide and yours is hitting something completely different, you're not going to have the same result. Now, obviously don't dump all of your materials into a piece of gear you're going to replace in 5 minutes, but once you're getting into higher end gear, these systems become increasingly important. And once you've got your tempers and masterworking where you want them, transfiguring that item can potentially push it even further. One individual upgrade might not look enormous, but when you're missing the correct temper here, a masterwork there, and another upgraded affix somewhere else, all of those differences start stacking up. This is another big one. You can copy somebody's Paragon board perfectly and still not have anywhere near the same power they do. The first thing to look at is simply your Paragon level. A lot of in-game build guides are being demonstrated on characters that have significantly more Paragon than the average player. If you're Paragon 180 and the person demonstrating the build is 250, you're missing a lot of nodes. That doesn't mean you can't use the build, it just means you shouldn't expect it to perform exactly the same yet. And make sure you're meeting the attribute requirements for the additional bonuses on your rare nodes. You might have the node, that doesn't necessarily mean you're getting everything from that node that it can provide. And then we have glyphs. Don't overlook these. Getting your glyphs to 51 is a good starting point, but that's not the finish line. As you continue leveling them, their bonuses continue getting stronger. A much higher level glyph could provide substantially more power than the same glyph at 51. So if you're looking at a build and wondering where some of the missing damage is coming from, check their glyph levels against yours. This is one of those progression systems where you might have everything in the correct place, but simply haven't developed it as far as the character you're comparing yourself to. Now we get into all the smaller things that are really easy to forget. Let's start with your sockets. Do you have the correct gems and runes? Have you actually leveled your gem? If you're using gems for main stat, upgrading those gems means more main stat damage. That's another source of damage. Your runes can be even more important depending on the build. Some builds use them to activate a passive trigger, another effect, or provide utility that helps the entire build function. Then check your mercenary. Don't just pick one and forget about it. Look at the passives they provide and see whether there's something that can complement the build that you're trying to do. None of these things individually might explain a massive difference in damage, but that's the entire point of this video. One missing optimization might be small, 5 or 6 of them aren't. Once the build is actually functioning correctly, now we can start looking for additional damage. And this is where understanding one small part of Diablo's damage system can help with being buried in the math. Turn on advanced tooltip information in your settings. When you look at damage bonuses, you'll notice some are marked with a plus, while others have an X. Generally, the plus bonuses are contributing to your additive damage, while an X indicates a multiplier. And additive damage is not all bad, you're just going to accumulate a lot of it naturally through your character. But because all of that additive damage is being combined together, don't automatically assume a giant number with a plus in front of it is better than a smaller number with an X. That multiplier may have a much larger impact, but there's another part that's even more important. Can you actually use it? An enormous multiplier against vulnerable enemies doesn't help much if your build rarely makes enemies vulnerable. So don't just chase X's either. You're looking for reliable multipliers that work with what your build is already doing. You don't need to calculate the entire damage formula every time an item drops. Just understand what you're gaining and whether your build can actually take advantage of it. And there's one final place you might be able to squeeze out more damage: your defensive stats. Now, I'm not telling you to destroy your defenses just to make your damage numbers bigger. If you're constantly dying, you probably have a different problem. But let's say you're comfortably surviving everything you're currently doing. Look at your gear. Are you carrying defensive stats you don't really need anymore? Maybe you have maximum life on a ring where you could use another offensive affix. Maybe you're significantly over what you need in another defensive area and you can move something around. That's when you could start experimenting with trading some unnecessary defense for additional offense. Just make sure you're actually gaining something worthwhile. And if making that change suddenly causes you to die constantly, you've probably gone too far. Dead characters don't do much damage. So if you copied an S tier build and you're nowhere near the damage you're seeing in the guide, don't immediately assume something is wrong with the build. It's not one magical item or one stat that suddenly gives you billions of damage. It's a bunch of different systems working together and multiplying the power of everything else. And once you understand what to look for, you don't really need a spreadsheet every time your damage feels a little low. You can look at your character sheet and start figuring out what's actually missing. And make sure you watch the video up next that will explain more on Diablo 4 systems.